we have a fabulous topic to get to, so thank you so much for coming indoors. This is hardly your first rodeo at the Chatham House London Conference 2018, so I need hardly remind you that everything is live streamed, it is on the record. Please do actively use the hashtag #CHLondon for your comments and your reflections on Twitter. As a former Facebook employee, it always pains me to say that, but it's true. So pop that out there and enjoy and relish in this discussion. As you know, my name is Elizabeth Linder. I am very proudly a senior consulting fellow here at Chatham House and also the founder of the Conversational Century, and we aim to have a very good conversation today. We're looking at a new connectivity technology and international policy. And for those of you who spent a little bit of time with the program before coming, you'll see this sentence: technology in its widest sense is proving both creative and destructive. Those two very different sides of the coin on the topic we have to discuss. On Wednesday in a taxi in Madrid, I was scrolling through my email and I received a message from one of the highest-ranking government officials in Europe. And she said, "Elizabeth, I tried a live online chat a few days ago." And she said, quote, "The level of hate is something I had never met before. I was extremely shocked. I still am. I am sorry that I cannot write to you on a more optimistic note." This coming from a very cheerful woman who you can see in her words was quite shell-shocked from the experience she had trying to reach out to people online. But on that same day, in that same taxi, I was following along on a fundraising campaign that was started in California less than a week ago by some individuals, also former colleagues of mine, who started a campaign, a fundraiser to raise funds for children in America who have been separated by their families in the current immigration crisis. They started with a goal of raising $1,500 US. And as of 9:20 a.m. today, that campaign has raised $18.16 million US. Million. You know, I had to write that down so that I didn't actually say thousand. It's million. And that actually is money in the bank. That's not pledges. That's not people saying, "I will do this once I pay my taxes." That's done. You know, those two extremes in that same taxi. On one side, the despair of an individual trying to connect to people with these new tools. And at the same moment, a campaign reaching millions of people coming together. And you know, it reminded me of one of those great soliloquies in Shakespeare. You can picture Kenneth Branagh, you know, delivering this, you know, internal dialogue in his head. At one level saying, you know, these new technologies, connectivity, bringing us into the brighter future, harnessing our global creativities for the first time in civilization, it's better than Dante's Paradise. But yet, on the other hand, is this the first step in purgatory as we make our way to an inferno that brings out the worst characteristics and the basis of our human existence? And where do we go from here? Oh, the despair. There's something of that soliloquy in this topic that I was just picturing a Branagh-like Shakespearean character saying, which is it? Which will win? Which do we want to see win long term? And so as we agonize over that question, I am absolutely delighted that I get to chair this session because I leave it to our illustrious panel to bring us some answers to a debate that I imagine will be most fiery and most exciting. So I'm joined today by Shumeet Banjari, Senior Advisor at Chatham House and Director at Reliance Jio and HP, by Lord Clement Jones, Co-Chairman of the All-Parliamentary Group on Artificial Intelligence and Chair of the Lord Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and Vicky Ford, MP for Chelmsford, and member of the Science and Tech Select Committee, as well as the leader of the all-party group on cyber. So we have an extremely qualified group of people here. Now, Vicky, I wanted to pass over to you first, if you don't mind, because in my experience, working with leaders on this dichotomous issue of the promise and the despair when it comes to technology and the way it's changing our world, it often seems to affect elected members of parliament most dearly and perhaps most personally. But I would love to open over to you for some initial thoughts to get our conversation going.
Thank you so much. And when I was preparing for today, I had a mass of different ideas, and I wanted to talk a bit about the scale of change that we're seeing, and also about some of the ways that I think the government and other parts of society might want to think about reacting, and the sort of conversations we're having on that. And first of all, on the scale of the challenge, I think we need to recognize that this is not just a digital revolution. The fourth industrial revolution is much, much more than that. And the sort of disruption that you're going to see in manufacturing, with the change from the combustion engine to electrical vehicles, the 3D printing, which means you can totally revolutionize the time in which it takes new products to get to market, will completely change the supply chain and nature of jobs. There's also a huge revolution going on in medicines, especially in understanding of genomics and how that interfaces with big data processing, so that we can find cures and treatments for diseases that we never knew before. That's the positive. But then there's a huge ethical discussion about who's going to get those treatments, how are you going to roll them out, what's the practicality of that. And if you think things are changing fast at the moment, it hasn't even started. We've been looking with a committee at quantum technology, which really makes today's change look like hand looms of old, you know, the super high-speed computing that will bring, the benefits of being able to look around corners, see under the earth that you'll be able to get from quantum technology will be phenomenal, but also brings huge cybersecurity implications, and cyber risk is the sort of biggest risk both to individuals, governments, and industry. So all of this sort of, that's just the start of the changes that we've been looking at in my year here. So, some thoughts. The government, and no government can ostrich. You can't pretend that this isn't happening. It's absolutely right, therefore, to say if change is happening, we need to try and stay ahead of the curve, which is why I'm so pleased that this government now is investing more in science and technology than any for 40 years. We need to make sure that we have the skills to adapt, and that's not just skills for young people, but recognizing that people need to skill through their lives, and change will coming. We need to recognize as government that we can't solve all of these issues alone, but it's about working both with industry and with consumers. We have a new generation of empowered consumers. I think that describes what you were hearing in the back of your cab, but those consumers will walk. They will walk if they think their ethics aren't being respected. That was the Cambridge Analytica story. They will walk if they think they're not being correctly protected. That was the lesson from the TSB scandal. We need to also recognize that cybersecurity makes activities, criminal activities that we used to see on the offline world now extra focused on the online world. The TSB, we learned that when an organization is vulnerable, it's vulnerable to attack. And actually our whole internet is not based with security at heart, and the Internet of Things, when you can be cyber attacked through your kettle, is a whole nother challenge. So just a couple of key points, what to do. The industrial strategy, I think, is a phenomenal piece of work in the UK, but I think we need to recognize that the industrial strategy and internet online safety go hand in hand. They're intertwined. Digital world can't be separated from the traditional world. They're intertwined. We need to recognize that we need to work internationally as well as domestically, and that brings the whole B-word Brexit challenge. How do we continue to work internationally on some of these issues as well? We need to make sure we don't leave anyone behind. Again, that part of the lesson from the Brexit vote was that many communities had been felt left behind by globalization and the pace of change. And finally, we need to be agile. We need to recognize that change is happening fast, and government also needs to be able to react fast to those changes and make sure that we stay ahead of the curve.
Fabulous. So skills, agility, ensuring we don't leave people behind, not putting our heads in the stand, all of those topics that seem very much top of mind from your perspective on the Science and Tech Committee. Lord Clement Jones, you have a specific focus on AI at the moment. Could you, weave in what we've just heard from Vicky in terms of what your perspective is on the AI side of where you see some of this going?
Yes, I hugely agree with Vicky on so many things here. I think it's very important not to get captured by one narrative or another. It's very easy to sort of take the Elon Musk view that AI is more important than, or more dangerous than nuclear weapons, for instance, or to take a sort of equally Pollyanna-ish narrative on the other side. What we tried to do in our select committee over the last year has been to really get underneath the skin of this and see, well, what are the opportunities and what are the risks that we need to mitigate? And, as Vicky's outlined some of the opportunities that rightly the government through the industrial strategy is addressing. It's made AI one of the grand challenges. It started putting more money into research and development and help with scale up for companies and so on. But the risks, of course, need to be mitigated as well. And the Chatham House paper actually is a very good paper on that, in that respect, because it puts the question of employment and whether or not we're going to get new jobs, whether we're going to get substitution or augmentation and so on in context. And I think it's really important because in all of this, the big theme running through our report was how do we retain public trust? So we retain public trust by having an ethical AI framework and of course that applies to new technology. It applies to all kinds of areas like blockchain and IoT and of course cyber aspects as well. But also it's this issue about reskilling, making sure that people are going to be fit to work in the new era, however fast that happens. And I liked the way that Vicky talked about agility. It's about adaptability. It's about being ready for this world, which is moving faster than we've ever seen before.
So both of you, even though you've addressed challenges, you both have an optimistic air to how it is that you see the government moving forward and tackling this. I would like you to kind of percolate on where you stand in the sliding scale of whether we should feel like we're in a good place or in a slightly dangerous place. But for the moment, Shamit, if I can pass over to you, we've heard two perspectives from the government side. You work quite a bit with on the corporate, on the company side, and with the entrepreneurs. Can you get us under the hood a bit in the private sector on this topic?
Sure. And I'm actually delighted to share the panel with two very enlightened politicians. I wish I could say that about most political debate today. But I do think that this commentary is very, very encouraging. Let me give you 3 parts of my life and what I see there. I am an out-and-out digital optimist. I absolutely believe that these are technologies that are going to change the world much for the better. And so those 3 parts are, I'm a director of a company called Reliance Industries, a company in India, largely hydrocarbons for a long time. In the last 5 years, an enormous investment, $35 billion plus in connectivity. And this is about bringing the mobile internet to India. And in the course of the last 21 months, that's 210 million users at about 10 million a month. And I get faster download speeds on mobile broadband in rural central India than I do on fixed broadband in St. John's Wood. And so I think that there is a fundamental point going on there, which is that bringing the mobile internet to a continent and being part of that has been an enormous journey. And we've learned a great deal about what happens when you bring the scale and scope of global knowledge onto a handheld device anywhere in the world. So I think that's kind of one big life-changing experience for me. At HP, as you know, we have a very, very strong initiative in 3D So I couldn't agree more, Vicky, that this is a revolutionary technology, and what it will do, especially with sensor impregnation, what it can do to supply chains, what it can do to not just sort of, turbojet nozzles on high-value things, but all kinds of other things. And then the third part of it, which is that in our own firm, we invest primarily in what I call tech bio companies as opposed to biotech. And by tech bio, I mean applications of data science and computer science in medicine and biology. And two examples of these companies, one is does what I call medical big data, and really that is about saying in the real world, if I wanted to answer the question, in the southwest of England, do ARBs work better than beta blockers to prevent readmission for heart attack? Today, that's a 2.5-year study, okay, to make that happen. Once you've got data configured, you can answer that question in a day, which sort of profoundly changes how you can do applications of this stuff in the real world for physicians in the NHS, for example. Another company that we have going on this does what I'll call human big data. So if you really took entire biochemistry profiles, molecular biology profiles of humans, it's about 1 terabyte of data. So not just the genome, but also down through the transcription system, the proteome, and the metabolome, and the lipidome. So these are the kind of fundamental molecular building blocks. And let me say that I can almost certainly tell you that cures to Alzheimer's will not come by looking in a petri dish. And they will almost certainly come by the inspection of human big data with AI. So these are three areas that I spend all my time in. And as a consequence of this, I travel a great deal, but I'm also a very happy man because I spend all of my time virtually in what I think are some of the most interesting technologies out there. So, I mean, that's kind of, just to get going, a perspective on this, which I think I'm largely in agreement with both my colleagues here, that I actually think the good far, far outweighs the bad. So.
Amazing. So as long as we stay away from St. John's Wood download speeds, we can remain optimistic about this space. But really exciting to hear that. Can I come back to Lord Clement Jones and then Vicky on your optimism, pessimism scale, perhaps to just frame, what are you most optimistic about and what are you most pessimistic about in this space, or just pick one or the other?
Well, strangely enough, I'm absolutely on the health front, because we looked at all the different applications and we made a decision to actually look at the health applications of artificial intelligence more closely than anything else, because we thought there were greater opportunities there. And, you know, we had the opportunity to talk to some of the great companies in the UK that have actually got involved in this, DeepMind being obviously the most prominent in many ways, but there are many others out there doing the same thing. The area that worries me, funnily enough, is not whether or not we will take a leadership role in the UK in terms of the ethical framework and so on, because that is very much accepted by government. You know, we have a Secretary of State who, in a sense, has a particular animus, which is great. It's in the lethal autonomous weapon area. I mean, we discovered that the UK has a different definition, and in a sense, with a higher threshold of definition than any other country in Europe, in NATO, that it doesn't really believe a weapon is autonomous until it has an understanding of intention and direction. Now, how many weapons are ever going to have an understanding of intention and direction? So, and the MOD has responded to us by saying we're not changing our definition, and we barely think it's necessary to have an agreement under the the Convention on Conventional Weapons. So, we want to see that, and I think at the end of the day, that narrative is in danger of taking over. You know, the media are great at talking about Terminator robots and so on, but we really should not be allowing that narrative to take root. And if we don't deal with lethal autonomous weapons by some kind of non-proliferation treaty, I think that's the danger.
Well, and it seems we were chatting a bit earlier about the challenge of specializing in the 21st century in digital and tech is it's everything. I mean, so far in just a few opening minutes of this panel, we're deep into, into health, we're deep into defense and weapons, we're deep into, connectivity and mobile. At this point, the digital and tech panel becomes about life, about every element of policymaking. Vicki, how about you? Optimism, pessimism, a little bit of both?
A bit of both. So areas that I'm optimistic about, definitely health. The ability to understand exactly which bit of the genetic makeup is affecting this child and find a cure for that child that never existed before. Phenomenal. Also very optimistic about being able to use new tools to understand the planet better. The next generation of satellites that's going to go up there with the sensors, which will really help us to understand weather movements, weather changes, the way the world is operating. We only have one planet at the moment, and we need to try and care for it. So I'm optimistic about using next new technology for that. Concerns. A lot of the discussion we're having in Parliament at the moment is about social media and the impact on especially young people's health.
Mm-hmm.
That whole fake news, and you described it as hate. That news can escalate very rapidly and be magnified because of the use of social media. That you get very targeted campaigns, especially against the big company issue. And I think big companies need to be very aware of that risk. I'm concerned about whether or not we would end up locking out innovation and small and new players, that we end up as regulators setting rules that only larger platforms can cope with, and we end up in that space. I think AI also helps solve some of these issues. So in the discussions on social media, we were looking at online grooming, extremism, etc., and the content young people are seeing online. But I'm also very aware that in the UK we've led on things like removing child sexual abuse images online. We've used AI to identify them, to get them off the internet, and where we can give clear legal parameters as to what's acceptable or not acceptable, you can help to try and remove the content, and AI actually helps with some of that. So as I said in the beginning, it's the need to be agile and try and recognize the risks as well as the benefits.
Yeah, it's. I noticed actually just this morning, as the Melania Trump jacket issue is blowing up in America, that one of the articles online had a little fact check. The photo of Melania's jacket has been fact checked as being real, versus the problem, of course, of so many of these photos being photoshopped. I don't know if anyone else clocked that, but I thought that was interesting, noticing that product tweak using technology to potentially counter some of the dangers. Do we have some questions from the audience at this stage? Tanji, please.
Tanji Morgan, St. James's Circle. This is more directed to Lord Clement Jones. I attend the evidence meetings that you have on AI, and I must say I've learned a lot. My question goes, though, to, for instance, healthcare. So I agree with you that, using the NHS, I mean, it's quite a rich data set. In order to facilitate a lot of the health benefits that we've talked about. But I also recently read where deep minds, there is a concern now about just making sure that the data is used appropriately. And maybe if you could speak to that, because maybe that is maybe a bit of a downside, versus the benefit. So if you could just talk to that.
Yes, I was hoping that somebody might be provoked, but that you're entirely right, because that's the other side of the coin. We need to build the public trust in the use of those sort of public data sets, and there is nothing more sensitive than the feeling that your personal data in health is being used and it's not being used in the proper fashion. And there's no doubt about it. The Information Commissioner made a report, and the arrangements between the Oil Free and DeepMind were not correct.
Yes.
They have since been corrected, and I hope that that will be, a better model for the future. But it's actually being seen to correct those in public and having protocols within the health service that make sure that things are dealt with properly. And one of the big recommendations that we made was precisely that what we need is data collected in a much more coherent way, that it's properly labeled, that it's usable, but the value is recognized. It's not just sort of, licensed cheaply or something, that the benefit comes back to the health service, and that it's all transparent to the general public. Because otherwise, lack of public trust in all of this new technology will be the killer.
Yes, trust in technology and trust in government and trust in the entrepreneurs. It's the first time we've really hit on trust, but it strikes me that's a huge point. Sorry, Vicky.
Yeah, and I think that the fact you raised that one issue that proves to the point, you get one rogue event and it just ricochets so quickly across building distrust in all different areas. One research trial has been done in a way that wasn't complying with ethics, and suddenly I'm not going to trust any of you, the experts.
There's just one point worth making, though. Of course, as a result of that public relations disaster for DeepMind, they set up, a review panel chaired by somebody of a pretty independent sort of mind, an ex-MP actually, and they now produce an independent report every year about DeepMind's use of data and whether it is, in a sense, properly complying and developing its products in the right way. So actually, in a way, that gave rise to a completely new way of dealing within DeepMind itself.
So we have Robin over here. Okay, another one here. Was there a hand as well? Okay, you two gents. And so let's go ahead and do this. Why don't we do Robin and you, sir, on the aisle, and you, ma'am, over here. And then I'm going to come back through the swing and capture you. But let's take those three first. Robin.
Yeah. Robin of Chatham House. I think I wanted to note in the report we just put out, which was kindly referenced as there, AI and IA, AI and International Affairs. One of the first recommendations in it is that AI expertise must not reside in a small number of countries, that there is a danger that the technologies might end up being dominated and seen as dominated by one or two countries, the obvious ones being the US and China, which, keeping in the IA theme, seem to be locked in to various types of arm races, one of which might be around IA. Now, as I understand it, as a complete novice on AI, but driven by big data, those two countries are the two countries with real access to big data. Big markets, China in particular, the United States, partly because of the way they treat private data and the way the companies are able to use it. So where does that leave the recommendation we made in our report? What are the prospects for countries that maybe don't have that access to big data? It's about regulating it so you can have it. What happens if data is not shared properly across borders? Europe has a problem sharing it amongst itself, and or it regulates it, so the EU becomes a regulator but not a producer. It just strikes me there is an IA international affairs dimension to this. Is really quite important, and we're at the early stages of it, and I'd love to hear the panel's views. I mean, where does India sit on this? I have no idea on what their approaches are to sharing data internally, and whether that's going to drive India as a new superpower in AI, for example.
Fabulous. So panelists, just kind of take notes of your thoughts on that. Thank you, Robin. We're going to go here to the aisle. We're going to go here to the lady, and then we'll respond, and then we're going to swing around and go to you, sir, and then who was it over here? Was it you, sir? Great. Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, the panel, for your thoughts. Ian Kelly, University of Buckingham. Touching again on the autonomous weapons, this is something that isn't really talked about, really. I mean, obviously it's still in the sort of developmental stages, but we need to make sure we don't fall behind on these, because it's moving at a very fast pace. We already have a chemical weapons convention. Do we need an autonomous weapons convention? Maybe just sort of throwing a big idea out there. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Hi, my name is, sorry, is this working? My name is Wafa Ben Hassin, and I am from an organization called Access Now, and we work on digital rights issues, so basically anything related to human rights in the digital age. My question, so AI and machine learning have been a very important topic in this conference, and I'm wondering what you all think about the role of corporations and big tech generally, because besides the issues of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and their impact on elections, we can also talk about more traditional issues like content regulation. What does that mean? Because these the data that these companies are using, as well as the company's presence in people's lives, has become so ubiquitous. And what is the role of government in response to these corporate actors? And how can we ensure that, for example, corporate actors implement human rights impact assessments in their work? Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So can we, Shamit, let's just kind of, let's begin with you actually. Robin specifically wanted to hear some of your perspectives on India, but then please feel free to take the other two.
Yeah, so look, I think that there's virtually no question that there are 6 companies in the world that are worth more than $500 billion, okay? 4 are in the US and 2 are in China. And without any question, the concentration of method, technique, intellect in these companies is absolutely dominant. There's just no question about it. There's a lot of points that have been made, and I'll sort of try and address. I actually don't think, I think this notion of a national policy on AI is sort of just a non-starter. I mean, the idea that somehow, with the greatest respect, that these committees will sit down and create an AI revolution this is all about what happens in education and what happens in the commercialization of technologies. If you don't commercialize technologies, you can be in a national lab and it's not going to really go anywhere in terms of mass. So if you think of the 2 big things that happen in data and digital, they are precision and amplification. My capacity to be precise in the targeting of my advertising is both irritating and useful. That's kind of what Facebook does, right? I mean, it kind of allows you to get much more precise about who you target. It also irritates politicians because precise targeting of voters worries them. But it doesn't change the basic point that precision is helpful, as is amplification. Amplification has bads, but it also has tremendous goods, such as everybody is now subject to the sunshine test pretty quickly, right? Everybody's out there in the open. So I think that there's an issue here. On the question, Robin, of how this works, globally, there is a lot of work. I mean, I think there's been some really good things done in India on this, but there's a long way to go on it. I don't think there is an India strategy. I think that there will be companies who will do things that might or might not help, including the one I'm on the board of. On Europe, I think that it just seems to me that there is just a huge amount of attention on the consumer internet, and by which I mean sort of Google, Facebook, that sort of stuff. Yeah, and these things are important, but I actually think that these are amplification mechanisms for bad things that exist in society anyway, okay? I mean, it's not like new forms of evil were invented on the internet. I think that just as many goods are amplified and made more precise, so too with the bads. And a comment that Vicky made in the green room before this, I think is the most important point to make. If it's bad offline, it's bad online, okay? So you don't need a special sort of set of regulations to kind of, and so what I worry about on this one, Robin, is the following. I'll say this in a kind of a rather blunt way. The GDPR is supremely well-meaning, but I think the risk that the regulatory establishment ought to consider is that SAP was the first and will be the last tech big cap in Europe.
Lord Clement Jones, can you come in especially on the autonomous weapons point or question?
I will, and I also, I don't want to spend all my answer disagreeing with Shamit. I think I disagree with almost everything he said, except the importance of education. So I'll leave it there. Just take it, that almost everything he said I disagree with, because in a sense that seems to me to be completely defeatist about trying to get some sort of framework where AI AI is actually used for good. The difference between AI and other technologies is the autonomous nature, potentially. It's not just waiting for superintelligence. Narrow AI has a degree of autonomy where we need to be the master, not the servant. And that alters the ethical situation, and we need to be fully aware of that. And on the data front, it is very worrying that we have the major tech majors where others who are wanting to develop AI in an innovative way don't necessarily get access to that data. And we recommended that the Competition and Markets Authority and other competition authorities actually look at the control that the tech majors have over data. We do need national strategies in these areas. Most of the other countries in the world are adopting national strategies, and in fact, many of them, and there's a great spread of expertise actually across the world. The issue is access to the data sets. You look at Malaysia, even Indonesia. The Economist did a report only a few weeks ago, actually putting us pretty low in the tables where we thought we were. We were number 8, I think, but others are higher up, but also many developing countries are moving up. So there's an awful lot happening out there. The big issue is that access to data, and we do need action on that. We can't just assume that this is all going to be hunky-dory at the end of the day. So on the autonomous weapons front, I entirely agree. I do think we need to be very conscious of the need for a kind of non-proliferation treaty on that. There is already a convention that we could add autonomous weapons to, the Convention on Certain Autonomous Weapons. We had some very good evidence, people like Noel Sharkey, who've been working on this for a great deal of time, and we were convinced that the UK was seriously out of step. And as long as we're seriously out of step, when normally we are a force for good on the international stage, I think is a matter of some concern. On the question of the role of big tech and the democratic issue, you know, the whole issue of online political micro-targeting, I think, is a real problem. And again, I disagree with Shamit. This is a different order of things. Being able to influence somebody under the radar by using the personal data that you've trawled from Facebook or other platforms seems to me to be a different order of things, and that needs to be covered by electoral law.
Shamit, I imagine you'll want to come in, but before you do, Vicky, the content regulation piece we haven't talked about quite as much in terms of that question, but we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, having been the victim of online micro-targeting via Facebook with fake news in my own constituency, can I completely agree that this needs to be addressed. Just quickly on Robin's point on data sharing, the UK is responsible for about 11% of the world's cross-border data flows. 3/4 of those are between the UK and the rest of Europe. International data flows only happen between the UK and the rest of Europe because we're comfortable with what happens to the data, which is why GDPR was such an important agreement, and why getting cross-border data flows as part of trade agreements also needs to be happy with how it's dealt with. We need to recognize that the way data is used continually evolves. The GDPR will need to continue to evolve. Some of its principles are already out of date. But one of the key differences between data sharing online and comments that are made in the traditional world is the anonymity. Okay, so you can hide and make comments and nobody knows who you are. There is more responsibility, I think, from the big companies. You know, Facebook recently has been accused of giving a blue tick endorsement to groups that may not have been violent, but definitely had relationships with violence. So what does a blue tick endorsement mean? I completely agree with whoever was talking about elections and manipulation of governments. We need to realize that that is a type of warfare, that hybrid warfare through fake news, through targeting. It is being used to try and destabilize legitimate democracies. And in terms of the automated weaponry and AI. Another real issue is the cyber attack. I mean, is the next WannaCry virus type attack going to be a deliberate rogue state attack? Yes, probably the risk of that is very significant. There are things that you can do to help build resilience, to work on having better standards inbuilt into parts of the internet to help build that resilience, but we need to realize that the attack you could make on a country today in order to take down the water or the energy or the networks is significant, and that's how you would destabilize a country, as happened in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, and the vocabulary is important, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, how we describe all of this. Is it hybrid warfare? You know, what are we looking at specifically? I think as a space, it still is new enough and evolving enough. We're still deciding which pieces of vocabulary we ascribe to these topics. Let's take our next round. So we have the gentleman here. We had the gentleman over here who was waiting. We'll take you over here, ma'am, and you in the front. So let's grab those four. Okay, well, you're smiling so nicely. You too. And then I'm going to have to ask the panelists just to really just pick out some key points because the time always marches so fast. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm called Aristide. I'm a diplomat and I'm a Chevening scholar studying diplomacy and business. My question concerns technology as a whole, not precisely AI. So I'm more interested in technology and power in society. So more and more in political literature, we're talking about innovation hegemony. Today, the top 8 richest people in the world have as much money as the bottom 50%. So from all indications, technology seems to be creating inequality in society. Now, inequality is an issue that we are trying to address, but so far it is our methods are proving inefficient. Is there anything which we can do to reduce the inequalities and the power dichotomies that it creates in our societies, even in highly capitalistic societies like the UK and the US, and even on a global scale where we see developing countries still remaining at the stages in which they were found when they came out of independence, excluded from trade and business cycles and even decision making. This seems to be perpetrated by technology. Is there an efficient way of bridging this innovator hegemony? Thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you. Great tie-in as well to Robin's question on international relations earlier. Over here, sir.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Graham Holman. I'm from a Japanese company, Sumitomo Corporation. My question is about cybersecurity. For an average corporate, say not in the tech sector, I don't think the issue of cybersecurity has gone mainstream yet. For example, a board may think about a secure intranet, but not much more than that maybe for the average corporate. I just wondered about the panel's insight into trends which will become mainstream for corporates which aren't in the tech sector. Just your average day standard, what are the board going to be concerned about going ahead? Thank you.
Fabulous, thank you. We had here in the front. We had you as well. Didn't I have more in this round? No, okay.
Thank you very much. I'm a Chinese Chevening scholar. My major concern about AI goes to privacy. We have discussed about Facebook issue. I want to mention face recognition technology. On one side, it helps us to keep the society in security because it helps us to find out the criminal. But on the other side, sometimes we find the public just like nude in face to those who have the big data, have this CCTV. How do you comment on it? How can we control the big company and the country to use their power properly? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Krisanga Fernando. I'm a Chevening scholar and I'm from Sri Lanka. I'm a state council back in my country. My precise question is, how could we deal with darknet effectively? How could we deal with darknet effectively?
Okay, great. So the dispersion of power, cybersecurity, face recognition, the darknet. Shamit, do you want to start us off?
I think that your question on inequality is a profoundly important question, and it should receive much more debate than it does, because, you know, of the point I made about the consumer internet occupying a lot of people's attention, because it's the stuff that most people see. The fact is that if you consider the scale of migration of jobs around the world in the last 20 years, I actually think that if you consider almost, I would say 80% of jobs that involve some level of human intervention can be done by bots, very broadly speaking, and probably done better. I mean, these technologies are happening today in all kinds of small startups around the world, working on this. And so I think that, there is a profound, I'm not trying to be funny, but if you consider the rate at which gaming is growing, and you consider who has 10 hours a day to spend on gaming, there are profound changes happening under our noses right now in terms of underemployment. And there is also sort of just clear unemployment, but underemployment, non-jobs, just things that people are doing, and more of that will happen. It's not just in routine automatable jobs like you might think of, such as checking invoices, but even in things like, there's some work done recently on imaging, retinal imaging, assisted AI-based diagnostics on retinal imaging are better than 80% of top ophthalmologists, okay? So I think it's a profoundly important question, and I think these changes, will make outsourcing and offshoring of jobs look actually quite small. On the cyber point the gentleman made, I do agree with you. I think that this is a difficult topic for companies and boards. And actually, you'd be surprised, it's not like major tech companies necessarily are in a much better place. Some are, some aren't. I think one approach has been in various bits of sort of company-related, whether it's the securities regulator or the company's regulator, to sort of insist on some form of this. And that's helpful, but I do think that things like the Institute of Directors, really ought to consider much more active and vigorous work on this topic. It is, there are only two kinds of companies that know they've been hacked and the ones that don't know they've been hacked, okay? Those are the only two types. Everyone has been attacked, okay? So it's a very important point, and I'm not quite sure how to get directors to wake up and understand what this is all about, but it's a big deal.
And on the individual level as well. Lord Clement Jones, perhaps you can address especially the facial recognition piece. Is there anything kind of that comes from your experience on the AI committee that can help us address that point?
Well, of course, one of the big issues, especially if you're thinking of trying to get some sort of ethical framework in place that covers most of the sort of major economies, is different attitudes to privacy. And in China, there is a different attitude to privacy. So facial recognition techniques are in common use and will be used by the state. The big question is, are there any consequences that flow from that in terms of the way that people like Tencent or Alibaba are actually going to be able to make use of that data? Now, if it turns out, and I've had a number of conversations with Chinese officials, with Chinese academics, it is a very big topic as to whether or not they will, at the end of the day, buy into not quite the GDPR. Nobody expects major countries like China to buy into the GDPR in total, but at least have a tightened view of privacy. And I think at the end of the day, if they're major companies like Tencent or Alibaba are developing AI using data sets which in a sense have been collected, facial recognition data, for instance, in a way that is not conforming to our norms, to our ethics, then that is going to create problems when they try and deliver those products in Europe and wider. And I think that's where some of the pressure will lie. At least I hope it will. I can't guarantee that, but that discussion has already started, and many of those major companies are only too well aware of that. I just want to comment on the inequality point, because this is a political hot topic, basically. It's both domestically and internationally. Now, the international point was made extremely well, I thought, in one of the Chatham House papers in that disruption report, because trade flows will change with AI, especially when Sumit made the point about bots and so on and so forth, being able to do quite a lot of the work that otherwise you might have had done by South Shoring. So that is going to alter the economic balance, and we do really have to watch out for that. If all the manufacturing or all the servicing, call centers, for instance, all those things all retreat back to developed countries, we're going to be in trouble. On the domestic front, I think we're also going to be in trouble unless we make sure that AI is unbiased and free of prejudice, i.e. the data sets are properly auditable, and so on and so forth. And also we need to think about what are corporates doing when they think about job substitution or job augmentation, because that ethical decision is one that companies will have to make. And I come back to things like ethics advisory boards and so on and so forth, and maybe they are something that we should institute not just for AI but for other forms of technology, talking about the types of cybersecurity that people need to have within their companies and so on, as well as the risk aspects, which of course are an audit committee and a main board aspect for most corporates as we speak.
Vicky, could you also help us extend the conversation on the dispersion of power question, especially based on your experience in Brussels? The coming together of countries. We've had a little bit of a perspective from India, a perspective from the UK, but you've sat, in the heart of a number of countries coming together on these topics.
Well, and I think part of the way you use personal data comes from how historically people have been used to the relationship between the state and the citizen. So that's why, when I was working with politicians from countries that had lived under communism, for example, much more concerned about how their personal data could be misused. And maybe that goes into a bit of the heart of the question about face recognition technology. If the face recognition technology starts to be used to say, I'm only going to offer this sort of product to somebody whose face looks like that, and I'm going to have an algorithmic bias to do that, then that is clearly wrong, which is why I keep coming back to that principle you stated at the beginning. If it's wrong in the offline world, it must be wrong in the online world.
Well, right.
I need to keep coming back to that premise. We've had generations of building rule of law to decide those ethical questions. We need to make sure that they work through the next revolution. The gentleman who said that he didn't think cybersecurity had been mainstreamed yet, I completely agree. You're 10 times more likely to be a victim of fraud online than offline, and that's just as individuals. But I think that in companies where they feel particularly at risk, it is definitely top of the board agenda. The financial companies, for example, absolutely right up there. But we do need to mainstream it throughout, okay, both as individuals and as society. And it's especially young people who actually become the victims of fraud, because they're tapping their phone to buy things left, right, and centre and adapt to the technology, and they have become much more victims. And just the last point about equalities, okay, because one of the benefits of the digital revolution is that it really can help inequalities. If you look at the example in India, fast rollout of digital IDs, meaning that you can get a welfare state to billions of people who hadn't been able to access a welfare state before, and using technology to do that. That's great, but again, it brings up new risks and dynamics. So you absolutely need to focus on how you make it work for all, because otherwise you will get that revolution that turns against it.
We have time for one more quick one. Was there anybody over here? Yes, sir, in the back, the last one.
Thank you. Tim Benton, Chatham House and University of Leeds. In biotech, the precautionary principle is well established in terms of releasing genetically modified organisms into complex systems, the real world. With the autonomous nature of artificial intelligence, you've got an extra dynamism on top of that, which would be like releasing a rapidly evolving organism into a complex system. What is the role of precautionary principle in this whole thinking about AI and its regulation?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Actually, you know what I'm going to...
I couldn't really hear that question.
Sorry?
I couldn't really hear the question.
Can I... sorry. Was there one key point you wanted to just pick out from that so that we can clarify?
What is the role of the precautionary principle in regulating or thinking about the development of AI?
Okay, so we need to wrap up in 5 minutes. There was a lady in the back over here that had her hand up, I think. Yeah, was it you? Can you just throw out your topic, and then I'm going to come to the panel to have us wrap up. What is it that you wanted to discuss?
About the ethical dilemmas that artificial intelligence pose.
Great. We haven't gotten in as much into ethics as we should, so that's fantastic. What I would love for you to do, I'm going to come back to each of you. We have 5 minutes. Please feel free to address both of the questions, but also, what topic do you feel you personally need to know more about to be better informed in the kinds of decisions you're making? Where is it that you feel you're going to spend your weekend really diving into the topics either that you cover professionally or you're interested in personally? Vicky, can I start with you?
Well, in terms of the topics that I've asked different select committees to look at, which is probably the ones that are in the back of my mind.
Excellent.
I've asked us to look at, I think we need to do more on cybersecurity. I want to know more about good and bad data, interoperability of data. How can you make it more shareable to make sure that you can harness the benefits whilst also protecting yourselves from the risk? And also on the skills side, I'm very focused on women and skills and the fact that we, in the UK, we have the lowest level of women engineers anywhere in Europe. I think it's an absolute shocker. And we can't leave 50% of the population behind. And that's partly by the way in which we condition girls from an early age into saying, I don't want to take risks with my career. It's wrong. We've got to focus on it and make sure this works for everyone.
Great, thank you. Lord Clement Jones, same question to you, and then also would you address the ethics question?
Yes. By the way, I think our Secretary of State talks about the sandbox approach to development in AI. Yeah. I'm not wholly convinced by that, but that's certainly, I think, trying to emulate what happens in the bio field. And I do think that if you can isolate in those circumstances under some sort of ethical license, whatever it may be, I think that's certainly a way forward. And of course, ethics are absolutely right at the center. And I would say that if you have an ethical framework, you then have a duty to design your AI up front in accordance with those ethics. That's the whole point. There's a lot of people who say, oh, you can't explain AI, you can't tell us what this algorithm is doing and so on. Well, of course, nobody's going to sort of unpick the actual equations and so on, but you do want to know how the outcome was reached in terms of the weighting used by the algorithm and the data that it used, and make sure that the data is unbiased and so on. So ethics could have a major impact, and I would like to see, obviously, not only national but international agreement on that. In terms of the areas I think we need to explore, I've just read a really interesting book by Anthony Seldon called The Fourth Education Revolution, and the essence of this, we've talked about health, but we're in the foothills as far as education is concerned. Yep. What we have to start delivering is a much more personalized education, but there are issues with that because we are again using personal data. Students aren't going to want to be surveilled, if you like, as part of their university experience. But in order to deliver a much more personalized and better value university experience, and indeed secondary school experience, we're going to need to look at things like that. So, that I think is extremely important. And I think for me personally, understanding a lot more about how you can use blockchain to promote democracy and how that all interconnects with the Internet of Things and AI is a bit of homework for the summer.
Fabulous. Shamit, drive us home.
Well, I think in my life, the thing I will spend summer on is on molecular biology, so I'll take an MIT online course and spend my time on that. In terms of things that I wish we would collectively spend more time on, I think that gentleman's question on inequality really worries me. I think that I really do believe that what has happened politically in a number of countries in the last 3 years is a direct consequence of a point Vicky made about people getting left behind. And
Yes.
I think that there is virtually no question that the consensus on globalization, in Munich or Michigan or Mumbai is the same, which is it wasn't good for me. And I think this next revolution is profoundly more important in terms of what it's going to do. So I actually think that collectively, if we can really, and including Robin at Chatham House, really, I think this inequality question coming out of this is a fundamental question.
Fabulous. Well, it seems extremely banal now for me to talk about lunch after we've dived into such a rich group of topics. But it is time for lunch, and the wonderful thing about lunch is it's an opportunity to keep the conversations going. There were a number of hands still up. And so my American networking style charge to you all is, for those of you who still had questions, find people in the room you haven't yet met and let them know what your question was going to be. And please continue this topic and continue the debate well into enjoying your sandwiches, which I believe will be served upstairs. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thanks to all of you for your time at the Chatham House London conference. We'll see you soon.